My name is Aria. I am 27 years old, and I've always had a complicated relationship with my family. Growing up, I was always the quiet one, the observer. While my cousins were loud and attention-grabbing, always running around the house causing chaos, I was the one sitting quietly in the corner, watching, listening, and processing everything. Maybe that's why I never really felt at home with my family. They were all so loud, so overtly passionate about everything, while I was just here. I could never seem to fit into the noise they created. But I learned to make peace with it. I learned to be content with my own company, to let the world happen around me without needing to be a part of the spectacle. Mom always made me feel different, not in a way you'd expect, but more like I was a burden to her, a responsibility to deal with, rather than someone she truly understood. I never questioned her authority, but I could always sense that her love wasn't the kind that came with depth. She loved in the way a person might love an object, there, present, but not necessarily with the emotional attachment that came with it. I didn't resent her for it. It was just who she was. I don't even think she knew how to love any differently. She was practical, always looking at life as a series of tasks to accomplish, like a to-do list she needed to tick off. And if something didn't serve a purpose or fit into her vision of the world, it was expendable. So when Grandma passed away, Mom's attitude toward her things didn't surprise me at all. It actually made sense, in a way. Grandma had always been the opposite of Mom, a soft, nurturing presence in my life. She was the one who listened, who cared about the small things that made life beautiful. She was the one who remembered the birthdays, the anniversaries, the quiet moments shared over cups of tea. To Mom, these things were useless. She didn't care about sentimentality. To her, it was all just stuff. It was something to be disposed of when it no longer had any practical use. I had always known that when Grandma passed, the jewelry and keepsakes would likely be sold off. Mom had made her feelings clear for years. Grandma's beautiful heirlooms, the delicate silver necklaces, the vintage brooches, the antique rings, meant nothing to her. They were just trinkets, as she liked to call them. Things that took up space and were best sold for money. The memories attached to them? Useless. I had been raised to understand that things were only valuable if they served a practical purpose. Sentimentality wasn't something Mom could ever wrap her head around. I had always been close to Grandma, though, in a way I could never fully express to Mom. Grandma understood me in a way no one else did. She never tried to change me, never pushed me to be louder or more like the others. She simply accepted me for who I was, quiet, introspective, and sometimes a little withdrawn. I remember the soft way she'd look at me when I sat beside her on the old armchair in her living room. Her eyes, gentle and wise, never asked questions but just listened, as though she already knew all the answers. She was the person who taught me to appreciate the small things in life, the way the light filtered through the curtains, the sound of rain tapping against the window, the smell of freshly baked cookies. When Grandma passed, the world seemed to lose some of its color. She was gone, and suddenly, everything felt heavier, colder. Her house, once warm and full of laughter, now felt empty. I never really knew how much she meant to me until she was gone. Mom had always said that I was overly attached to her, that I needed to let go and stop holding on to the past. But how could I? Grandma was a piece of my past, a living, breathing connection to the person I was before the world became so cold and practical. Mom, though, had already made up her mind about what would happen after Grandma's death. The house was to be sold, the possessions divided, and everything that had no real value was to be discarded. Mom's practical nature took over immediately. She called a family meeting as if it was just another business transaction, another task on her to-do list. We were there, sitting in the living room, and she spoke with that familiar, almost robotic detachment. "We'll sell everything. The jewelry, the furniture, all of it. We need to liquidate and move on." I remember the way her voice sounded that day, flat, without emotion. It was the same tone she used when she was deciding what to donate to charity or when she was cleaning out the attic. To her, the things Grandma had left behind weren't memories. They were just things. They were merely physical representations of a life that had already passed, easily replaced by something new, something more practical. Mom, what about Grandma's things? I asked, hesitating. Aren't we going to keep any of it? The jewelry, or the old books she had? Mom gave me a look, one that was both dismissive and almost pitying. It's just jewelry, Arya. We don't need it. We don't need any of it. It's just stuff that takes up space. You know that. I felt a pang in my chest as she spoke. I wanted to protest, to argue, to tell her how much those things meant to me, but I knew it was pointless. She wouldn't understand. To her, everything had a price tag, and if it didn't add value to her life in a tangible way, it was to be sold or discarded. I was left with one thing, just one small thing, after everything else was sold. It was a pendant, a delicate piece of jewelry Grandma had given me when I turned 18. She'd given it to me in the quiet of her living room, her hands shaking slightly as she handed it over. For you, my darling, she'd whispered, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. A piece of me to carry with you always. I had kept it with me, tucked away in my jewelry box, through every move, every phase of my life. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but it was the only thing I had left that connected me to her. To Mom, it was just another piece of jewelry, nothing special. But to me, it was everything. When I held that pendant in my hand after Grandma passed, I felt a mix of sadness and gratitude. Sadness because I couldn't hold on to any of the other things that had once belonged to her, and gratitude because this one small piece of her had been left for me. I didn't know at the time how much more it would mean, how much more it would change my life. But I knew it was the last thing I had to remember her by. I never thought much of it, just a piece of jewelry. But I kept it for sentimental reasons. It was the only thing I had left that connected me to her. One day, a few months after Grandma passed, I decided to take the pendant to a local jeweler to get it cleaned and appraised. Nothing too extravagant. I figured I'd wear it more often, maybe polish it up a little. I had always been the type to hold on to things, even the smallest, most insignificant items, because they held memories. This pendant was no different. Every time I looked at it, I remembered Grandma's soft voice, the way she would gently stroke my hair when I was upset, the way she always smelled like lavender and cinnamon. The pendant, though small and simple, carried the weight of all those memories, all those years of comfort and love. I hadn't worn it much in the months after her passing. The pain of losing her was still fresh, and I couldn't bring myself to touch anything that reminded me of her too closely. But something shifted that day. I had an overwhelming urge to hold on to the past a little longer, to keep a piece of her with me in a more tangible way. Maybe it was grief, maybe it was a need for something familiar, but I decided it was time to do something more with the pendant. I made my way to a local jeweler's shop, a quiet little place tucked away on a side street. I had passed it countless times over the years, but I had never been inside. The shop was small, with a faint smell of metal polish and old wood. It felt intimate, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down as soon as you walked through the door. The jeweler himself was an older man, with wiry glasses perched on the edge of his nose. His hands were steady, but there was a softness in his demeanor that suggested a deep respect for the craft. I liked him immediately. "Good afternoon," I said, holding the pendant in my hand. "I was wondering if you could clean and appraise this for me." He nodded, glancing at the pendant with a practiced eye. "Of course," he said, taking the pendant gently from my palm. "Let me just have a look." I sat down in one of the small chairs near the counter, my eyes fixed on him as he carefully examined the piece. The room was quiet except for the occasional sound of him tapping his tools against the metal. At first, everything seemed normal. But then something shifted. He paused, looking at the pendant more closely. His fingers lingered on the delicate chain, almost as if he were unsure of how to handle it. I watched, confused, as he moved the pendant around in his hands, a furrow of concentration knitting his brow. "Is something wrong?" I asked, trying to mask the unease in my voice. He glanced at me, his face slightly pale, as if he'd just seen something he hadn't expected. There was a flicker of apprehension in his eyes. "No," he said, his voice just a touch too strained. "It's just, well, this is a very interesting piece." He hesitated, then added, "You're aware of what's inside, aren't you?" Inside? My heart skipped a beat. What was he talking about? I shook my head, confused. Inside? No. I didn't know there was anything inside. He cleared his throat, glancing down at the pendant again, his hands more cautious now. Let me show you, he said softly, almost as if he were handling a rare artifact. He gently pried open the back of the pendant with a small tool, his movements precise but slow, as if he were afraid of damaging something fragile. I watched, utterly bewildered, as he carefully removed a tiny folded piece of paper from within the frame. It was so small, no bigger than a matchbook, and the paper looked ancient, its edges frayed and yellowed with age. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. I felt a surge of curiosity mixed with a creeping sense of dread. Why was there paper inside this pendant? Was it some sort of hidden note from Grandma? I had no idea, but I was suddenly desperate to find out. My hands trembled slightly as he handed the folded paper to me, his fingers brushing mine for just a moment, sending an unexpected jolt through my body. The jeweler didn't speak. He simply watched as I unfolded the paper slowly, almost reverently, as if I was about to uncover something momentous. The first thing that hit me was the strange set of numbers written on the page, numbers that seemed almost too precise, too important to be random. As my eyes scanned the note, I realized that it was an account number, a bank account number, with detailed instructions on how to access it. My mind spun as I processed the words. There, written on the small piece of paper in neat handwriting, was a string of digits, a $3.2 million bank account number. Alongside it were clear instructions detailing how to access the account, with a series of steps that I could follow to gain control of the funds. I sat frozen, the weight of what I was reading sinking in, each word becoming more surreal than the last. $3.2 million. It didn't seem possible. My grandmother, my sweet, quiet grandma, had hidden such a massive amount of money in her pendant? Why had she never mentioned it to anyone? I felt the room tilt, my vision momentarily blurring as the realization hit me. The pendant that had seemed so simple, so inconspicuous, was now suddenly the key to something far bigger than I had ever imagined. It wasn't just a keepsake anymore, it was a secret, a mystery. And in that moment, I felt as though I were standing on the edge of something life-changing. I looked up at the jeweler, who was watching me closely, his expression a mix of concern and curiosity. I could tell he was waiting for my reaction, probably uncertain if I even understood the magnitude of what I had just discovered. I was still trying to wrap my head around it. How had Grandma come to possess such a sum of money? Why had she kept it hidden for so long? I was overwhelmed by the questions, and the weight of the discovery pressed down on me like a physical force. I don't know what to say. I finally whispered, my voice shaking slightly. I had no idea. The jeweler nodded, his face softening with understanding. It's not uncommon for people to hide things like this, especially if they don't want anyone to know. But this, he paused, his gaze flickering between the note and me. This is something serious, something you'll need to think carefully about. I nodded numbly, unable to speak. All I could think about was the life-changing nature of what I had just discovered. This was my grandmother's legacy. She had kept it hidden, not just from the world, but from all of us. Why? What had driven her to keep such a secret? My thoughts raced as I tried to make sense of it all. I was no longer just the granddaughter holding on to a pendant. I was holding on to something far more significant, something that had the potential to alter the course of my life. And the more I thought about it, the more it felt like a sign, as if Grandma had known that I would find this one day, when I was ready. I folded the paper back carefully, clutching it tightly in my hand. The pendant, once just a small token of remembrance, had become the key to unlocking something I could barely comprehend. But one thing was clear, it was mine to unravel, and my life was about to change forever. I did what any sensible person would do. I took the paper straight to the bank. I almost felt like I was dreaming. The entire situation felt surreal, like something out of a movie. Here I was, standing in a small, quiet bank branch, holding a slip of paper that had the potential to change my life. The note Grandma had hidden in the pendant, the account number, the instructions, everything felt so unreal, as if I had stumbled into a secret world I didn't belong to. My hands trembled as I handed the paper over to the bank manager, explaining the situation as clearly as I could. It wasn't long before I found myself sitting in the plush, quiet office of the branch manager, a man with a slightly graying beard and a too polite smile, listening as he worked his computer, cross-checking details. The atmosphere felt sterile, businesslike, but my mind was swirling with thoughts I could barely keep up with. How had Grandma come into such wealth? Why hadn't she ever told me about it? I had so many questions, but in that moment, I couldn't do anything but wait. The process felt like an eternity. But eventually, after a series of confirmations and some rather polite but pointed questions, the manager handed me a form. "The funds are now accessible," he said in a measured voice, glancing at me. "You can withdraw them at any time, Mississippi." I could barely speak. The reality of the situation was hitting me slowly, and as the weight of the moment sank in, I felt both dizzy and elated. This wasn't just money. It was a legacy, a piece of my grandmother's life that she had somehow kept hidden, just waiting for me to discover it. And just like that, I had access to more money than I had ever imagined. I felt my heart race as I walked out of the bank, the paper now tucked securely in my bag. The air outside felt different, somehow. Heavy, filled with possibilities. My head was spinning with thoughts, the money, the impact it could have. But as much as the idea of wealth was tempting, it didn't overwhelm me. No, what I thought about was Grandma. I thought about the way she lived her life, always giving, always putting others first. She had never cared about material things. She had always cared about people, about causes that made the world better. In the midst of all the shock and wonder, I found my thoughts drifting back to the dreams I had always harbored but never acted upon, dreams that now seemed so much more possible. I had always wanted to start a foundation in Grandma's name. She had always talked about how important it was to give back, to fight for what's right, to support the underdog. She had lived her life with compassion, with love, and with an undeniable sense of justice. And suddenly, I felt this fierce, urgent desire to honor that. I had a vision of what I wanted it to be, a foundation that would support causes she had cared deeply about, women's rights, education, and the arts. She had been a champion for women her entire life. I remember the way she would read books to me, stories of brave women who fought for their rights, who spoke up when no one else would listen. She had always told me that being a woman didn't mean you were weaker or less capable than a man. It meant you were stronger because you had to face the world on your own terms. I also remembered her passion for education. Grandma had always believed in the power of knowledge, the idea that a good education could change a person's life. She had volunteered at local schools, tutored children in math and science, and worked with programs that helped girls stay in school. She had spent years fighting for equal opportunities in education, believing that no one should be limited by their gender, race, or background. And then there was the arts. Grandma had loved the arts in every form. She had a deep appreciation for music, for painting, for theater. I had grown up surrounded by her collection of classical music records, her beautiful watercolor paintings that lined the walls of her house, and her endless encouragement to explore my own creativity. She had always said that art was the soul's language, that it could heal, inspire, and change the world. It felt like a dream come true, one that I could finally bring to life and share with the world. I could feel Grandma's presence around me, like she was guiding me, urging me to move forward, to take this opportunity and make it something meaningful. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of purpose. It was as if everything had led to this moment. I spent the next few weeks meeting with lawyers, accountants, and advisors. I wanted to ensure that everything was set up properly, that the foundation would be run with integrity and transparency. It wasn't just about giving money away. It was about creating something lasting, something that would make a difference. I researched organizations that were already doing similar work, figuring out where I could best direct the resources, where my money could have the most impact. It was a whirlwind, but it was a whirlwind of hope, of excitement. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just existing, I was creating something that would outlive me. Something that would carry Grandma's legacy forward. But as excited as I was, not everyone shared my enthusiasm. A few months into the planning process, I received a phone call from my mother. Her tone was sharp, colder than I had expected. "Arya," she said, her voice tight, "I've heard about the foundation. I assume you're planning to do something for the family too, right?" I could hear the unspoken words hanging between us. She wasn't asking for an update. She was demanding a share. The tension in my chest tightened, but I kept my voice steady. "What do you mean?" I asked, my pulse quickening. "I mean, all that money, your grandmother's money. You're planning to use it to start this foundation, but what about me? What about your own family? Shouldn't you be thinking about us too?" I was quiet for a moment, my thoughts racing. I could hear her frustration, the way she was trying to mask her jealousy with concern. She didn't care about the foundation, I knew that. She didn't care about women's rights or education or the arts. She cared about what she could get from this windfall, what it could do for her. And I was no longer willing to play that game. "No, Mom," I said, my voice firm, surprising even myself. "You already sold your part when you sold Grandma's things. You didn't want any of it. You sold everything." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the frustration building, the way her breath caught as she processed what I had said. "You're being unfair," she finally spat. "This is all your grandmother's money, and it's mine too. I'm your mother, Arya. I raised you. I deserve a share." I stood firm. "You already made your choice when you sold everything after Grandma passed. This is my part. I'm using it to honor her, to do something good in her name." There was another long silence. I could almost feel her anger radiating through the phone. But I didn't care anymore. I wasn't going to back down. This wasn't about me or her. It was about my grandmother and the legacy she had left behind. I ended the conversation quietly, my heart pounding but my resolve stronger than it had ever been. I didn't know how my relationship with my mother would change after that, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let her take away something that was so much bigger than both of us. The foundation was my way of giving back to the world that had given me so much. It was my way of honoring Grandma's memory, and no one, no matter who they were, was going to take that from me. A few months later, Mom called. Her tone was cold, and I could hear the underlying bitterness in her voice. I wasn't surprised. Our relationship had been strained for years, but something in her voice this time was different. The words she said were loaded, as if each syllable was carefully chosen to cut deep. "I heard about the foundation," she said, her voice thick with an edge of accusation. "I'm sure you could have done something for me with that money. After all, I'm your mother." I could almost feel the weight of her resentment through the phone. I knew what she was implying, even without her spelling it out. She wanted something she always had. But this time, there was something more to her words. It wasn't just about money or jealousy, it was about control. She was trying to lay claim to something that didn't belong to her anymore, and I could sense it in every word she said. The foundation had become a symbol of my independence, of my ability to make my own choices. And to her, that was unacceptable. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, thick with unspoken tension. The words hung there, lingering in the air like smoke, but I didn't flinch. I knew that whatever I said next, I couldn't back down. Not this time. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I knew this conversation would be difficult, but I wasn't about to let her manipulate me. Not after everything that had happened. "You already sold your part, Mom," I said, my voice steady but firm, even though my heart was pounding in my chest. I could feel the familiar weight of the situation pressing on me. "You didn't want any of it. You sold everything when Grandma passed. This is mine." There. I had said it. The words came out clearer than I had expected, and even though I could sense her fury on the other side, I stood my ground. I wasn't going to let her guilt trip me. I wasn't going to let her rewrite history. There was a long, heavy silence after that. I could hear the sharpness of her breath through the phone, as if she were struggling to find the words to respond. I could almost imagine her face twisted with frustration, her eyes narrowed, searching for an angle, a way to turn the conversation in her favor. But there was no angle anymore. There was nothing she could say that would change the truth. Her silence was a telling moment. It was the kind of silence that said everything without saying a word. In that pause, I could almost feel her disappointment settling between us, like a cold weight that neither of us could escape. But I wasn't going to apologize for standing up for myself, not this time. When she finally spoke again, her voice was tight, and I could hear the anger seeping through. "You're being selfish, Arya. This isn't just about you. I'm your mother. I deserve something. I'm the one who raised you." The words stung, but I didn't let them in. Not anymore. There was a time when I might have let her guilt me into submission, when I might have second-guessed my decisions.
But not now.
Not after everything I had gone through, after the long months of reflection and planning. I had spent so much time trying to prove myself to her, trying to live up to her expectations, and all it had ever done was drain me. "I'm not being selfish, Mom," I replied, my voice calm but resolute. "I'm honoring Grandma's memory. I'm doing something good with the money. Something that would have made her proud." Another long silence followed. I could hear her breathing softly on the other end of the line, the words she wanted to say swirling in her throat. But I knew better than to wait for her to change her mind. She had made her choice when she sold Grandma's things, when she brushed off the sentimental value of the jewelry, when she dismissed Grandma's legacy as just jewelry. And now, she wanted to rewrite that history, but I wasn't going to let her. I felt a strange sense of clarity settle over me, like I had reached a point of no return. This conversation would mark a turning point in our relationship, I knew that. Things would never be the same again. But I wasn't afraid of that anymore. Still, despite my certainty, there was a pang of sadness in my chest. I had spent so many years trying to make her proud, trying to win her approval, trying to prove that I was good enough. But nothing was ever enough for her. She was never satisfied. No matter what I did, it was never the right thing. And in that moment, I realized something I had never allowed myself to fully understand. I didn't need her approval anymore. I had spent so many years trying to please her, to fit into a mold that she had created for me. But I wasn't that person anymore. I wasn't the daughter who had to follow her rules. I wasn't the one who needed to appease her anymore. I was Arya. I was the woman who had found her own path, who had discovered something worth living for, something bigger than the petty squabbles and expectations that had bound me to her for so long. I could feel her anger rising again, but I didn't back down. "I've made my decision," I said quietly. "I'm using this money to do something good, something that matters. Something Grandma would have wanted. And if you can't accept that, then that's not something I can change." There was no response. I knew the conversation was over. In that moment, I could almost feel the shift in our dynamic, like a door closing between us. And though it hurt, though a part of me wanted to scream and cry and make her understand, I knew this was what I needed to do. For myself and for Grandma. I ended the call without a goodbye, not because I was angry, but because there was nothing left to say. The conversation had run its course. The choice had been made. And I couldn't keep living in the shadow of her demands, of her never-ending need for validation. The silence that followed was a relief, and yet it was heavy. But I knew it was necessary. I had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and while that terrified me in some ways, it also felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I wasn't guilty. I didn't regret it. But I knew that moment would change things between us forever. Still, I had no regrets. I had made my choice, and I had done it for the right reasons. I was finally doing something meaningful with my life, just like Grandma would have wanted. And in the end, that was all that mattered.